Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Identifying and Acquiring EV Charging Facilities. This is in partnership with ACT News and Voltera. My name is Jonathan Colbert. I'm the Vice President of Marketing here at Voltera, and I'll be your host today. We will explore key strategies and considerations that will enable you to successfully identify and acquire prime locations for EV charging facilities for your fleet. Here at Voltera, we really understand these challenges of developing EV charging infrastructure at scale, and we're here to help you overcome them. So during this 1-hour session, we'll discuss the top challenges fleets face when setting up EV charging infrastructure, how to identify suitable sites, and we'll share some insights from our team. My favorite part also, we'll present a case study on an active Voltera site that'll give you some real-world perspective. Before we get started though, there are a few housekeeping items that we want to present to you and make sure you keep in mind. The presentation slides from today's webinar will all be available, and we'll send them to all the registrants following the webinar. In addition to that, we're going to try our hardest to make sure we dedicate as much time as possible to the live Q&A at the end of this webinar. So if you have any questions, please submit them. To do that, you'll use the Q&A box. It's at the upper right-hand corner of your screen. So I have a different view, but please look at the upper right-hand corner of your screen to see that. And then the questions that you do submit, make sure you're directing them to the organizer. So there are different drop downs that you can select. Make sure you select organizer. That way you're not blasting everyone in the webinar with your question. At the end of this webinar, also, before closing your browser, we kindly ask that you complete a 30-second survey. This is basically an opportunity to see what topics that are most interesting to you for future webinars. And then also, a webinar recording will be sent out next week to the email address that you used to register. And then this recording will also be available on the ACT News website. If you have any technical issues and need any assistance during the webinar, please email GNA Marketing, and that's using the email address you see on the screen here. And we'll also drop that email in the chat, and they'll work with you to try to assist you as quickly as possible if you have anything that comes up. So with all that out of the way, let's get to it. We have a great lineup of speakers today, and we'll really go into detail about a few things. First, I'm going to talk about Voltera and what we do, and I'll tell you a little bit more about who we are and kind of our backstory. Then Scott Fisher, our Senior Vice President of Sales and Business Development here at Voltera, will discuss this fleet transition process that he's dealing with a lot of partners and customers of ours, and really the top challenges these fleets are facing when they're setting up charging infrastructure. And then finally, we'll hear from Hannah Jacobus. She's our Vice President of Real Estate and Development. She'll talk about how to identify suitable charging sites, the insights we've learned from our experiences with this process, and then she'll go into a case study reviewing an active site that we have. So with that, let's talk about Voltera and what we do. So Voltera provides the critical infrastructure necessary to support the full electrification of transportation. So what we do is we focus on siting, building, owning, and operating strategically located and fit for purpose charging facilities. This means those facilities need to be at the right time and at the right place for fleets that are using electric vehicles. So we understand the importance of operating these facilities, and we strive for the utmost in reliability. As you know, in the fleet realm of doing business, you need high uptime. And since our customers demand it, we're building a business to be able to provide that. You can go to the next slide. So Voltera was purpose-built by EQT, that's one of the largest and most active infrastructure investors globally, and also EdgeConneX. This is the critical infrastructure partner of choice for some of the world's largest tech companies. So together, we're leveraging the strong equity backing from EQT and the extensive infrastructure development expertise from EdgeConneX to electrify at scale. You can go to the next slide. With that, like adding to Voltera's long-term capital backing through EQT and this infrastructure DNA is a rapidly growing team with deep experience and a proven ability to deploy charging at scale. Collectively as a team, and not just the leadership team, but if you extend out to the whole team, we've deployed more than 1,000 charging sites and have transacted on more than 10,000 properties. Our leadership team has experience from leading teams at charging networks, electric vehicle manufacturers, utilities, energy companies, and even data center companies. So with that, now that you have a little bit of an understanding of what we do and who we are, let's delve deeper into the challenges fleets are facing right now when they're setting up EV infrastructure. As I mentioned before, our first speaker today is Scott Fisher. Scott's going to shed some light on customer challenges we're hearing about today, what we're doing to overcome those challenges, and also some markets we're currently active in. Scott, over to you.
Great, thanks, Jonathan. I'm really happy to be here and appreciate everybody joining. I think, I was at, as probably many of you were, the ACT Expo in Anaheim recently. And I think we were, I was surprised from having been to the conference in the past, how many people were in attendance, how many companies were there. And I think for fleets right now who are looking to make the transition to ZEB, it's probably a little daunting, not just to be thinking about all the infrastructure that needs to happen to make that transition, but all the different companies that are out there and what they do. And I think one of the things that I want to do with the few minutes that I have is provide a little clarity on what Voltera does and how we're similar and maybe different from other companies in the market that you may be hearing about. So I think one of the things we started when we started Voltera within EdgeConneX, and I started at the company at EdgeConneX in late 2021 when we were just getting going and had a few folks, including Hannah and a couple of our other colleagues. We came from the standpoint of in the data center industry, it takes 2 to 3, 4 years to build sites. And part of that's because you need to bring in a significant amount of power. And so when those of us who'd been in the EV charging industry felt and heard from customers, hey, this EV ZEB transition is going to be hard because the utility is telling me it can take 2 to 3 years to bring power. That kind of came naturally to my colleagues and our investor base. And from the standpoint of taking 2 to 3 years, we know from experience in the data center industry that maybe the best time to plant a tree, if you will, was 20 years ago, but the second best time is now. And so really, and Hannah's going to be talking about this during her presentation, but really putting one foot in front of the other to get these infrastructure projects started because we know this takes time. A second thing, as we were thinking about starting Voltera, what we also had in mind is that we had, and I had been in the EV charging industry working at EVgo and Shell previously, and all of the projects that I had done in my past were at existing customers' existing site. And I think as we saw the scale of what is happening and what we think is going to continue to happen in the fleet EV charging or in the fleet EV world, I think there was a recognition on our team that a company's or a fleet's existing site may or may not work well for the scale of the ZEB transition or the EV transition that companies wanted to make. And when we talk to customers, we always say that using an existing site can work well and is likely the cheapest and quickest option. It doesn't mean it's not free of the challenges of bringing power or bringing in the right infrastructure, but there's a whole EV charging industry that can service that. And it probably is the low-hanging fruit, if you will, of putting in fleet infrastructure. So for us, we're looking to find customers who, for whatever reason, they don't have the site to develop. Maybe they don't own the site and their lease is running out in 2 years. Maybe the utility can't bring power to the site, or for whatever reason, it's not fit for purpose for the scale of the electrification that a fleet wants to do. That's really kind of our customer base, and we're not generally working on a customer's existing site. And as Jonathan said earlier, we recognize that when fleets are used to just going to a fuel pump and fueling up in kind of a liquid fueling world, we're not quite at that stage of reliability in the EV charging industry. And anybody who's been in the EV charging industry knows that that's something the entire industry is working on. And starting a company now, or as we did in late 2021, early 2022, I think we recognize that maybe the reliability challenges that fleets had faced in the past, the industry overall was and is starting to take care of that, and we can be a part of that in making these sites really reliable. Go to the next page. Yeah, so Jonathan talked a little bit about the type of company that we wanted to build, and when I started talking to the EdgeConneX team and joining the company in late 2021, my experience had been It's important to have, let's say, people like me in the sales and business development area, but it was really critical we build a team across the value chain for all the things that we're going to need to do to make a site successful or make a customer successful. So at Voltera, I mean, our team, my team is a few folks. We've really leaned into building really strong capabilities around, everything from real estate development to engineering, to folks who can go into a site and do due diligence, charger procurement, customer experience. So we've really tried to focus on everything that we're going to need to do to make these fleets and these sites successful, from an end-to-end perspective. I'm going to zero in, since this is a webinar really focused on site development. I'm going to maybe give a little bit of a preview to some of what Hannah's going to be talking about in a few minutes. And the site development piece is one that, even for me, having been in the EV charging industry for 10 years, really have learned a lot in the last year and a half about how a skilled real estate development, project development company does work. And a lot of this was taken from the EdgeConnect's experience, a lot of it from experiences that other folks have had. But what I noticed right off the bat is that, you never find a project where everything that you want lines up correctly. So if you find a site, you're not going to have, let's say, the zoning line up, the timing on the real estate transaction, the perfect knowledge of the utility power, all of the customer requirements, the customer commitments, your internal approvals to purchase or lease a site. You're never going to have those line up exactly the way you want them to line up. And so what I think a company like EdgeConnects and now Voltera that has experience in that area does is kind of make calculated risks around how to move a project forward, and in my case, how to move a customer contract forward, sometimes without perfect information. Hannah's going to talk a little bit later about a site that we are building in Linwood, California. We made an announcement several months ago around ACT about a site we purchased in San Francisco. It's a parking garage, 1700 Pine in San Francisco. And, going back to that process last year, we felt we had so we purchased it, and we felt we had a decent bead on a customer commitment, which we eventually did get. We had a decent bead on zoning and land use. And one thing, of course, I'll mention about when you're developing independent sites as opposed to developing an existing customer fleet site is that you're going to, in many cases, have to deal with a zoning and land use process. We felt like we had a decent bead on that. We had some good conversations with PG&E and still felt relatively comfortable about power. And we had gotten good feedback on what became from the eventual customer on what the site ideally would look like from their perspective. And so we went into a discussion with our board about purchasing the site with a number of those things kind of in place, but not fully in place, but where the timing on the real estate transaction was pushing us to make a decision. And we often find ourselves in that type of situation where, you may be perfect on one of the 5 things you need, good on 3 of the 5 things you need, and, maybe some risk on the other piece. So, we I guess are getting somewhat comfortable with making those multi-million-dollar decisions. A number of folks from our board had been part of EdgeConnects, and that's how the whole data center industry developed. And the idea is that you do 5 sites and 10 sites, and maybe 1 or 2 of them in the end doesn't work out for whatever reason. But that's part of the business. I think the other thing that kind of surprised me was in joining EdgeConnects and then Voltera was just the fact that you might take 6 months and spend a significant amount of capital on due diligence before you have a customer, and that's just kind of, you might look at 5 sites before you find one. So again, some of those are things that let's say a professional development organization will do that were new to me when I joined the company a year and a half ago. Please go to the next slide. So what I wanted to just mention here was some of the areas and parts of the country where we're active in. So if you look at this map, the blue represents sites, and we might have several sites where in a particular blue area where we're actually doing specific projects. Maybe we own the site already and have a customer. Maybe we're in some level of PSA negotiation, but we're relatively close to having one or more sites in these locations. And as I mentioned, several of them have customer contracts already, and several of them are sites that we've purchased without, maybe with a customer in mind, or maybe not yet with a customer in mind, where we have, we will have charging capacity available in these locations. The pink is an area where we're probably looking to go based on what we've heard from customers. We're active, not just in California. We think the entire U.S. or certain metro regions in the U.S. are ready for the fleet transition to electrification. And we're really excited about the opportunity. One other thing that you may notice from looking at this is that we haven't built a corridor, right? This isn't. We're not saying we're building a corridor, across a particular interstate. Our investors are infrastructure investors, which means that we have access to very low cost of capital to develop and build sites. And part of the reason why the capital cost is low is that it's relatively low risk, or should be relatively low risk. Obviously, this is a new industry, and anybody who's investing in it is taking some level of risk. But for now, at least, from a corridor perspective, our investors aren't yet comfortable with the idea of if you build it, they will come. And we're generally not trying to take utilization risk. Where we have a customer, we're hopefully getting a contract over a long period of time that allows us to get some certainty on having a return on our capital. And where we're purchasing sites without a customer, clearly that's taking some risk, but obviously there's an expectation that for our investors that we will be able to get customers using those sites. And based on the conversations we've had with various fleets, we're feeling good about some of those decisions. So I think with that, I'll end my section, and looking forward to hearing my colleague Hannah Jacobus speak. She's our Vice President of Real Estate and Development. And with that, Hannah, I'll hand it off to you.
Thanks, Scott. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Today I'm going to share some insights and challenges and hopefully solutions of site identification and acquisition using our site that we're developing, as Scott mentioned, in the Port of Long Beach area as an example to facilitate that. You can expect more to come by way of announcements, but for now we are going to keep the specific site confidential for our customer. So this project started with a customer who had a need. They were focused on truck delivery and knew that they would need charging, but didn't have the capacity as a company to dedicate the time and resources that it would take to execute on that need. And I'd say about 50% of our projects start that way, as more of a build to suit custom for a customer in a specific geographic location that they have a need for. The other 50% of our projects as a company are developed on a thesis basis that we have, where we see demand in an area and want to get the charging capacity well ahead of that need due to the complex and lengthy process that it takes to get there. So this specific project was challenging for many reasons. The customer needed capacity as soon as possible, as many do. So every step of the project was high pressure, high level of scrutiny on both sides. The real estate market in this area and most areas at the time of this transaction was really hot, heavily competitive, a lot of pressure to get that deal done, a lot of demand. We transacted at a time of peak real estate pricing, which kind of made the economics that much more difficult on both sides. And then, of course, finally, there was a relatively high power requirement for this particular size of site and for any project, really. But that increased the complexity and timeline to deliver the end product. So to accomplish this project will be about 2 years from kickoff to full energization. And I know Scott touched on, that being pretty typical for timelines at projects of this scale. That's a little bit on the longer side of what we're seeing, throughout the whole US, but pretty common in the LA area. They've got, a little bit longer than average energization timelines. And then, of course, permitting and procurement being close seconds to what extends the overall development life cycle. Really, the only thing that we know for sure going into this project and others, and still true today, is that unknowns will come up. And so we just have to build our team to be agile and flexible for when those problems arise. Go ahead and go to the next slide, please. Okay, so this region, I'll kind of talk about this region of the Port of Long Beach area, heavily supply constrained as mentioned, but specifically for trucks, of which this project was designed for, because of the increased demand for trucking industries in and around port areas, especially in the recent past. And they've really been taking a toll on those communities in this area. They've overburdened them. And so these communities have really started to restrict that type of use and development in the area. Even though the Port of Long Beach, as a city has been an early adopter when it comes to EVs, very pro and make it easy to do business there. But the only way they're really going to support their goals in and around the port is to have the surrounding communities kind of come along with them, and we're going to need those areas for the infrastructure. At Voltera, we really promote that we're not adding traffic and congestion to these roads and communities, but instead replacing the existing diesel trucks with, of course, the cleaner and quieter options. But it's a new concept. It's taking a lot of conversation, a lot of education to help people understand that trade-off and trust, that what we're bringing is really going to be beneficial to the area where we land a site. Many communities like this idea, but frankly, it's easier to say no or kind of tell us to go somewhere else, when it looks on the surface like there are many options. But in reality, it is pretty difficult to find a site that is going to suit all of the needs that we have. We see this in other use cases beyond trucks as well. Just note, many communities are trying to promote housing or other uses. They might be concerned with traffic or just think that, this site design is a little bit of an eyesore. So again, it comes back to that education. And, we're going to need to have these sites somewhere to progress the EV adoption. Even though California as a state has taken some positive steps for permitting and to promote EV infrastructure, the specific use is not in all the local zoning codes, as Scott kind of touched on. So we have to ask city officials to paint outside the lines, interpret code, maybe write new code. And even if we can get some momentum on this path, which it takes work to do, the challenge is that these processes are decades old and often move slow, which doesn't match up with the fast moving and competitive real estate market, as well as, the customer demand and timeline to get these sites online. We're paving the way in most of these communities that we're entering, that you saw on that map and others. So, to slow down, be patient, garner support can be painful, but really pays off in the long run. The LA area is particularly challenging because there's actually 50 plus unique municipalities, of which, in and around the Long Beach area with this radius, there were dozens that we could consider. And each one has a different approach to this use, or, a different set of people that might be making these decisions, a different decision-making process, different objectives. So having to navigate all those together at one time made this one specifically challenging. And, this project is going to be one of the biggest of its kind with very little precedent. Often cities want to point to each other. And as we've headed other places in the US, cities are wanting to know how are others handling this. And there's not been a lot of precedent. So we're really creating this all as we go. So the scope of this case study specifically, that more will come about, but there were 60 plus trucks. The specific site design included, just as many spots for employee parking, plus an office, a guard shack, really trying to amenitize the site. But ultimately that led to about a 2-acre land requirement, maybe 1.5 to 2 acres that we were shopping in the marketplace for. And so sites of that size, of that magnitude, are definitely even harder to come by in the highly constrained area. The resulting power requirement of getting, 60 plus ports led us up to 12 megawatts, which was most certainly going to require system upgrades from the utility, 2 separate feeds of power, complex engineering. There was a tight project timeline, as we touched on, specifically because of the truck delivery timeline from the customer that we're all working backwards from. Then when it comes to the area we searched in, we had to be really mindful of the radius traveled from the port, highway access, smooth ingress egress to and from the site, and many other site characteristics that narrowed the pool of viable sites considerably. Finally, since this customer was contracting for the entire site, we had them with us every step of the way, weighing in on decisions, learning together. Really, it was a very collaborative process. Next slide, please. Great. So to find the ultimate site that we landed on, we have to cast a really wide net and maybe not appreciate all of the sites that you have to look at that fall out for one reason or another throughout the process. We had to set clear priorities as a joint unit and quickly vet those risks that Scott touched on earlier. You can eliminate some sites pretty quickly, as they're being brought to you due to easily detectable desktop reviews, but other sites can make it much further along in the process and spend tens of thousands of dollars in due diligence costs before something might pop up that's truly detrimental to the project. Still, this de-risking process is well worth it before we actually make the acquisition and get into construction, because the later you get down the timeline, the more painful it's going to be. At Voltera, we have tools to be able to quickly vet sites. We have actually over 50 data sets that feed into a system we use, but it's really an art and a science to come to the right conclusion. There's always going to be some factors that you can't put into a calculation. We have detailed checklists and processes, but we'll never know everything. It's all about knocking out as many high dollar, high impact risks as you can in the shortest amount of time. In this case, I'd say the numbers of what we looked at, about 50 plus sites probably. We toured and negotiated with at least 5 to 10 in and around the area as they popped up. And then we actually took 3 sites through a pretty detailed due diligence and design. And the site that we selected wasn't really our favorite choice for a lot of reasons, but it brought together the most positives that would end up creating a good project. While land use and power are probably the 2 most obvious hurdles for EV charging sites at this scale, there's also many other limiting factors that might get ignored to identify and transact on the real estate. Some of those factors include the location, site access, some of the requirements we touched on earlier, environmental risk when it comes to trenching and cost of remediation, coming to workable economic terms with the other side of the party, which I'll talk more about in a minute, what the overall utilization and design is and how that correlates to an adequate cost of construction that's going to be, of course, shared by the parties, and then the site characteristics as well, and if that's going to lend itself for a good and efficient layout. Most of these factors also require in-person teams to go on site to vet, which depending on where you are, is almost always additional time and money. We like to get the design and budgeting process started pretty early in due diligence after those on-site visits. Even though it costs more upfront, you might do that a few times and not have a project go through to fruition. It really gives us a deeper look at what's possible and viable at the site for the customer and for ourselves. And then it accelerates the timeline on the back end. We make sure that different user groups within our company can put eyes on that due diligence as we kind of head into final decision on the project, just to see if any other concerns or ideas can get raised outside of the development group. And then as far as the overall acquisition structure, at Voltera, we do like to own properties for a number of reasons. One, we have much more control over our development and operations. We have pretty clear downside risk with the ability to resell the property. We have great long-term predictability. We're able to underwrite deals over a longer time horizon, which really can help our returns, but also the pricing that we're able to pass on to customers. And finally, it makes the deal timeline upfront shorter and smoother. To negotiate a purchase, there's a lot less complexity when the other party doesn't have to be the owner and landlord of that site into the long term. And we're able to have a pretty firm window of due diligence to do all of the de-risking process that I talked about a minute earlier. However, I'll caveat that, to be successful, especially in dynamic markets like the Port of Long Beach, we know we have to remain flexible and creative and be able to act fast. And lots of times that does come with leasing. In this particular case, it did end up being a lease. And so even though we don't yet have a full operational history to be in a position to negotiate leases, having the deep equity backing that Voltera does with EQT, as Jonathan touched on, really helps us to make deals quickly. Our access to capital and also nimble decision-making authority as a company and board is pretty unique to people in this space. At the end of the day, you can do a lot of research and never be fully prepared for the challenges ahead for any project going into development, let alone this new and pioneering use. People are going to have a lot more questions as we go through the process. There's going to be more complexities that come up, and there's going to be things that no one's thought of yet. So really, we're all learning as we go. Next slide, please. Okay. So just a bit on some of the relationships that enable a lot of the things that we talked about. Just finding the sites to begin with can be half the battle. Voltera specifically has decades deep broker partnerships. We try to source sites from all different angles, having people cold call, finding them from utilities, municipalities, national partnerships, sister companies. We really empower our partners to represent us in the market to try to get ahead of competition and find and make deals that otherwise others couldn't. We're able to leverage, parent sister companies for reputation and security that, we might not otherwise be able to offer. Then when it comes to actually making the deal, it's also about who you know. In this particular example, and many others, we're able to make connections with the other party within their company that maybe others weren't able to. And that at least takes down some of the walls in the negotiation at the negotiation table to get to what's going to work for both sides. Though a lot of owners kind of see this use as a risk, we were able to separate ourselves from a lot of the alternative uses for the site that were also in competition with the depth of our equity backing, the unique opportunity that our business model presented for this owner to get into this space. Our long-term outlook, our ability to commit long-term, and then of course our access to capital, where we were going to take on a lot of the high dollar improvements to the site. And then at the same time, we're responsible to remove those at the end of the day and make sure the site is just as we took it. In the truck space, many of these competitors, especially in and around the ports, are smaller operators who may be able to pay a higher monthly rate in the short term, but that doesn't work great for owners of real estate for the long term who are looking for financeable options. Understanding who our competition is for each site and what the alternative use is, both in the immediate term and in the potential future, is critical to knowing what it'll take to win. While our industry is relatively new, we offer an opportunity for owners of real estate to get in the space and find someone who really believed in the benefits, both holistically and tactically, with regards to permitting and success of the business model. So we were able to beat others out. In this case, the large portfolio owner we made a deal with also had relationships at the city that we were able to leverage, and so made that part of our due diligence at least go a little quickly. We'd already done quite a bit of groundwork with the other cities in the area, as I mentioned, so we had a pretty good idea by that point of what was going to work or what would be higher risk. Building these relationships over time before the ultimate ask for a permit or whatever it may be really helps us to make a name for ourselves in the community. Understanding and dialoguing with them, as we did site selection, was paramount to our success, not only in finding the real estate, but then down the road when it came to permitting timely and in an efficient manner. We really wanted to illustrate that as a company and desired owner of real estate in the community, we would find win-win solutions to the concerns such as traffic and congestion by timing and staggering routing of trucks. We could assist in upgrading road infrastructure, and then of course promote the focus on supporting the growth of EVs and required infrastructure in LA and California, which improves the community overall. But our outreach and relationships have to go beyond city officials to other community groups, economic development groups, labor groups, businesses, neighbors, others. We want to make our brand and benefit widely known because knowledge really is power in this case. By establishing rapport, we've been able to find supporters who understand the benefits we bring to their community, and getting a champion within more of these slow-moving and difficult organizations helps to not get lost in the shuffle and find ways around problems that are bound to arise as the project progresses. At Voltera, we certainly believe in working with best in market partners, and we wouldn't be successful without them. We align ourselves with their processes, requirements, goals to ensure smooth and efficient collaboration. Next slide, please. This is the last thing I want to touch on, just to dive a little bit more into the utility process, and then I'll wrap up. So utility connection, of course, as we know, is one of the more challenging parts. We haven't really found utilities to say no, but there's often a but or a caveat. So working collaboratively together early and often is really the only way to succeed. We've been able to leverage, connections, meetings in person, relationships, starting early. We engage utilities before we even start looking at sites in most cases. And in this example with SCE, they have, a first-class team of client-facing individuals, and they have capabilities to do desktop studies to really help guide us of where to look, where's going to have power, where's going to be easy, or, you're not going to know everything. They certainly don't claim to, but they've enabled us to be really successful in this area and in this site specifically. We also want to maintain throughout that process our eligibility for potential utility incentives, which comes with additional requirements, making sure you're on the same page with the utility, with our construction team. So we've integrated that into our process as well. And then last slide, I'll just wrap up for a couple minutes and then open it up to questions. The last point I'll make is, sometimes that's as important to look at what didn't work than it is to, all the things that actually went right in this scenario. So I'll mention a few things that were lessons learned and, experiences we got throughout this case study. We certainly looked at a few sites, and in this area, it's not uncommon where the environmental remediation was too great to make the numbers work, or the remediation was too complicated. We found sites in cities here that, they just weren't ready for this use. They weren't ready to partner with us in a way that was going to make this process efficient for us. We competed for several sites from a real estate perspective that we weren't able to win at the end of the day for lease or for purchase. And then we also found some sites where the timeline to the interconnection and energization was going to be too great, well beyond the delivery of the trucks. So we're still in this process, still a lot of work to do, but we feel pretty optimistic. A lot of things went our way with the city, this SCE who was able to work quickly and nimbly with us, and a great owner who was supportive, and then finally a customer who's been a great partner for us. So it comes together. It can feel like maybe at times there's nothing that'll fit quite right. But we're getting a lot of momentum in this space and seeing a lot of success. So with that, I think I'll pass it back over to Jonathan, and we'll probably open up for some Q&A.
Thank you, Hannah. Very valuable insights there, and also thank you, Scott. And what we're going to do is we're going to actually go to some of the questions that were submitted before the webinar. But I want to remind everyone, if you go to the upper right-hand corner of your screen, you can go into the Q&A section and just submit any questions you have, but be sure to send it to the organizers and not to everyone. So one question that we had from before, and I'd say, Hannah, if you could answer this one, is this process a data-driven process?
Yeah, so I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but I'd say probably more than 50% is. We've got a lot of tools these days that can help inform the site selection process. I'll name a few of the data points that go into our tool that our team is building. We look at traffic patterns. We look at utility, like where substations are, where maybe from a desktop view you think you could get access to power. We do look at the zoning code from a high level, where similar uses might be permitted, parking, industrial areas. We certainly look at incentives applicability. And then, you can look at shapes and sizes of sites. So you put those data points together and certainly informs our site selection to a certain extent. And then we'll always want to get kind of boots on the ground, people familiar with that market that know things that, won't always go into the tool.
Awesome. And this next question is, are there grant funding sources available for EV charging infrastructure and vehicle purchases? Scott, do you think you can take that one?
Yeah, absolutely, Jonathan. And I think, obviously this is I think probably everybody on this webinar knows this is probably the golden age of grants for electrification and EV charging grants. The Inflation Reduction Act, of course, has, and NEVI, which was passed before that, has a ton of opportunities. Hannah mentioned utility funding from and it's not just utilities in California that are providing that funding. And then I think, clearly another source is, outside grant-making agencies, whether it's, California Energy Commission, NYSERDA, and those types of opportunities exist throughout the U.S. One thing we're spending a lot of time looking at and understanding right now is the 30C tax credit from the Inflation Reduction Act, which has a bit of complexity to understanding and then integrating into your business. One of the characteristics of it is, in order to qualify, the site has to be in a designated area, generally a lower income area, and then that also requires union or prevailing wage, apprenticeship, and a bunch of other requirements that require us and our customers to filter through our respective operations in order to maintain qualification for the grant. But that's one that we're obviously really excited about, and part of everything that we're really trying to do throughout our operation is to ensure that we can get the cost of the eventual charging to the customer down as low as possible. And Hannah mentioned maybe it's just doing a better job of negotiating real estate prices, buying the best charging equipment at the lowest price, maybe just ensuring high utilization. Maybe there's a few fleets that can use it to maximize utilization of the site, and then also clearly to take advantage of grants and incentives and make sure we're passing the benefits of those on to our customers. And we have capabilities internally to work with our customers to ensure that those grants are fully realized.
Scott, that was a good segue to another question here. You mentioned disadvantaged communities, and this question specifically says, how can we implement these charging stations in disadvantaged areas? So maybe more specifically, what do we need to do to be able to actually basically solve for one of those requirements in this 30C tax credit? So Hannah, can you tackle that question?
Yeah, I'll start, and maybe Scott has some stuff to add. I think we found actually that's more common than not, really. When you're matching up sites of the size we're looking at in the areas of the cities that permit them, we've found it more easy to find sites in potentially more disadvantaged areas. And that, of course, matches up well with the ability to access some of this additional funding, and have, tax incentives, other incentives, maybe cheaper ways to operate and do business. So I think it's pretty easy to do and something that we're definitely focused on doing.
And I think I'll just add that, of course, Jonathan, it comes for us with the responsibility to make sure that we're being, good corporate citizens in those communities, and whether that's local jobs, whether that's electrifying a site that already has diesel trucks going in and out of it is a win-win. And in a few cases, we're electrifying sites that maybe aren't used to having trucks or light duty vehicles come in and out of them, or maybe at a lesser rate. So that's maybe a little bit more of a challenge for us to work with the community to explain, the benefits that come with electrification. Hannah mentioned getting other communities used to what we're doing in the LA area. We don't, and we've learned maybe the hard way, not to assume that just because we're electrifying that everybody's automatically going to embrace us from day one. We think we're doing the right thing, but it requires communication and being a good partner.
Awesome, thank you both. This next question is kind of a two-part question. It's how do you acquire sufficient funding for charging infrastructure, and also how do you streamline the process?
Yeah, and I'll just mention, Hannah talked about some of it, and I guess I talked about, our investor, and I don't think whether it's from us or for our, from our, competitors or other companies in the industry, I don't think the biggest problem we have is finding capital, but obviously all of us in this industry are working at finding ways for that capital to want to invest. And, we have a pretty good, let's call it, box of criteria from our investors that we have to make sure our projects, fit into. Some of the things I would say that help motivate, let's say, our investors to move these sites forward is, that we have a customer that seems really interested and perhaps has made some sort of commitment to us, that maybe we have spent the time getting the economics in a place where the site is a win-win, for the customer. Maybe we have to bring in a few customers. We've talked about, a lot of what we've talked about is making a pretty large fixed cost investment in building EV charging infrastructure. And so a site's probably not going to work if for us or our customer, if we have a customer that's only using it 2 hours a day or 3 hours a day. The more, we need to make these sites active, 24/7, and that requires, some work. But I think if we do that, we get these sites down to a lower price, such that our customers want to make that commitment, and such that our investors want to make that investment.
Maybe I'll just touch on the efficiency of the process or streamlining it. I don't think there's any kind of golden ticket that, takes away all the challenges that we're finding, but I'll just kind of double down on trying to explore these hurdles early. Doing the early due diligence, spending the extra time and money, getting out ahead well in advance of the actual need in the communities you're going to, in the cities, with the utility companies, understanding the lay of the real estate market. 3 years in advance really isn't too early to be thinking about need, which I think most of us are going to find that's a little daunting to think about what your need could be in a few years. So just starting to explore that, knock on some doors, have some conversations, start to quantify demand is really going to pay off in the long run to making the actual, when the time comes, to making it go a lot faster.
We're going to switch over to some of the questions we got during this webinar. And the first one is, what is the best means to submit potential sites to Hannah and the entire team? So
I like that question.
Yeah, sorry, what? Say that again.
What's the best means to submit potential sites to Hannah and the team?
I think we actually have a portal on our website that collects them. So they'll go to our real estate team and all the layers of vetting that we talked about.
Yeah, you can go to volterapower.com and go down to the footer and you'll be able to reach out to us directly. The next one is, how do you ensure the energy source coming into the site is renewable or mostly renewable? I think either one of you could tackle that one.
Yeah, maybe I'll take a first shot. And I spent before a few of my colleagues at NRG started EVgo back about 10 plus years ago. I was in the energy retail energy world, so I mean it's a good question and one that as an industry we need to continue to get the right answer for. I mean, in California in particular, I mean, of course the grid is decarbonizing by virtue of the RPS standards, and so being there, you get the benefit of that process. On the map that I showed earlier, we have sites in a place like Texas where there is an opportunity for companies like us, and our sites are large enough. Let's say 2 megawatts, 3 megawatts, 4 megawatts of utility load and significant kWh coming off of that load, that we have the opportunity to leverage a market like Texas to purchase zero carbon electricity. And so I think some of it will depend on where the site's located, but it's definitely an area where we're really starting to take a look. And of course our customers are really interested in making sure, okay, if we're making the transition to electrification, let's take advantage of the lowest carbon electricity we can.
So this next question is specifically about the Linwood site. And the question is, the site in Linwood, is that capable of charging 60 Class 8 semi-trucks at once? Are these 60 spaces for 60 semi-trucks? Which is
yes.
a great answer.
Yes. Yeah, that's the idea. We're kind of stepping into that amount of power, and so there'll be some load management to get us there to learn as we figure out the staging and but the concept of the way these sites and the ports are developed seems to be that they're going to be out throughout the day doing a lot of their routes coming and going from potentially the Inland Empire or wherever their end distribution site is. And so the primary charging time happens overnight. So it's really important that the customer can have all of the trucks kind of landed, parked, and plugged in there at one time.
Another one is, well, you know what? I'm gonna pivot real quick because I saw another one. Is Voltera looking to corner the port markets? Is Texas on your roadmap? Let's go back to the other one.
Maybe I'll answer the question about. I think it would be presumptuous of anybody to say that they could corner the port market, and I'm hoping that the market. I think we're all hoping that the market for port electrification is far larger than what any one company can handle. And I think we see ourselves as one of several companies that can be, valuable in providing charging sites. We haven't gone down the path, and I don't think we will go down the path of, for example, purchasing vehicles to lease to customers. We want to work with fleets who are already doing that. As to the question of Texas, yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've spent a lot of, and Hannah can speak to this as well. We've spent a lot of time in Texas. Of course, Texas is one of the leaders in renewable energy, and I expect that the same to follow in terms of fleet electrification.
So what are the most important factors when it comes to site selection, and how do we rank one site versus another?
Yeah, so I'll reiterate a few of the points and maybe try to go in order of priority of what we found, I'd say maybe to be most painful to the least painful as they come up, and I think about like our due diligence report that our team comes up with at the end of the day to say like, yes, let's move forward with this site, or no, let's not. And up there again, as I know we've said almost exhaustively, but the reality is that's where we're spending almost all of our time these days is utility procurement and land use. So those two items are always the first phone calls we make in a market, top of the list, most detailed sections, and it may sound simple like yes, no, but there's so many shades of gray of those two boxes. Like I mentioned, the answer is never like yes or no from the utility. It's when do you need it? How can we step into it? Are there creative ways to get it there? Can we share some of it? There's a lot of ways to deliver that, and maybe there's more on this side of town, or could you go a block this way or that way? That's on the utility side. On the land use side, some of the other areas of gray come up of maybe what's the access to the public like? What are the structures you're going to put on the site? Similarly, like, could you consider this part of town or that part of town, or what hours will you be operating? There's a lot of nuances to kind of those two check boxes in the site selection list. And then heading down from there, we're evaluating permitting process and timelines, environmental phase 1, phase 2s. We're looking at, site layouts, what the capacity could be, what the costs will be, site grading, site characteristics, demo needed, property condition reports. Those are probably the major buckets. I'd say our due diligence reports ends up being probably 40 pages. So, would be happy to engage with folks and share more details on those points, but those are probably our major check boxes for every project.
Thank you, Hannah, and thank you, Scott. We're right at time, so we just want to say thank you to everyone for joining. And just before we conclude, we just want to remind you, we're here to really support you in your journey forward in terms of electrification. We have an experienced team. We have a deep bench of knowledge and a unique business model that gives us a lot of access to capital. So we're here to help you tackle these challenges and learn with you and grow with you. So if you have any questions and you want to explore partnership opportunities, please reach out to our team directly, and have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.